History is written by the victors, but it is often directed by the paranoid. We like to imagine World War II as a clash of visible titans, but the most decisive blows were often struck in the shadows, months before a single shot was fired. This is the story of intelligence failures, the moments when the world's most powerful empires were caught completely blind, not because they lacked information, but because they refused to believe it. An intelligence failure is rarely about a lack of spies. It is about a failure of imagination. In 1941, the Soviet Union had over 100 warnings that Hitler was about to invade. Stalin's own spies even gave him the exact date and hour. Yet, when the panzers crossed the border, the Red Army was caught in its pajamas. Why? Because Stalin was convinced he was the one doing the manipulating. He looked at the data and saw only what he wanted to see. This is the mirror imaging trap, assuming your enemy thinks exactly like you do. But the Allies weren't the only ones failing. We will explore how the invincible Japanese Navy sailed into a trap at Midway because they couldn't conceive that their unbreakable codes had been cracked by Americans in flowered shirts. We will see how Hitler was convinced the D-Day landings would happen in Calais because of a dead body washed up on a Spanish beach carrying fake documents. These weren't just mistakes, they were systemic collapses of reality. The thesis of this series is simple. In war, information is a weapon, but interpretation is the trigger. We will dive into the greatest blunders of the war, from the tragedy of Pearl Harbor to the nightmare of Market Garden. You will see how arrogance, bureaucracy, and brilliant deception turned certain victories into catastrophic defeats. Because in the game of shadows, the most dangerous thing you can do is believe your own propaganda. The war wasn't just won by the best soldiers. It was won by the side that listened to the truth, however uncomfortable it was. It's time to look at the blind spots that changed the world. In the spring of 1941, the Soviet Union received over 80 explicit warnings that Hitler was about to attack. Spies in Tokyo, double agents in Berlin, and even deserting German soldiers provided the exact date and hour of the invasion. Yet, on June 22, the Red Army was caught completely off guard. This wasn't a lack of information, it was a catastrophic failure of interpretation by one man, Joseph Stalin. Stalin was trapped by his own paranoia. He believed the warnings were a British provocation designed to drag the USSR into a war with Germany. He practiced mirror imaging, assuming Hitler was as rational and calculating as he was. Stalin convinced himself that Germany would never risk a two-front war before defeating Britain. He looked at the massive buildup of German troops on his border and dismissed it as pressure for diplomatic concessions. He didn't just ignore the intelligence. He threatened to execute the officers who brought it to him. The result was a slaughter. Thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground within hours. Entire armies were encircled because their commanders were forbidden from taking defensive positions that might provoke the Germans. The Barbarossa failure proves that the best intelligence in the world is useless if the person at the top has already decided what the truth is. Stalin's arrogance didn't just cost lives. It nearly cost him his entire empire. The lesson of 1941 is chilling. The most dangerous blind spot isn't what you don't know, it's what you refuse to believe. As the panzers raced toward Moscow, the Allies were about to learn their own painful lesson across the ocean, where another giant was sleeping with its eyes wide shut. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the United States was not blind, it was distracted. For months, American cryptanalysts had been reading Japan's top-secret diplomatic codes, known as Purple. They knew a strike was coming. They knew the deadline for negotiations had passed. Yet, when Japanese torpedo bombers appeared over Oahu, the Pacific Fleet was literally anchored like sitting ducks. This wasn't a failure to collect data, it was a failure to separate the signal from the noise. The intelligence was scattered across a fractured bureaucracy. The Navy didn't talk to the Army, Washington didn't trust the commanders in Hawaii with the full picture. Analysts were overwhelmed by a mountain of intercepts, most of which pointed toward a Japanese move in Southeast Asia. Because the US expected an attack on the Philippines or Malaya, they ignored the noise, suggesting a daring 3,000-mile carrier strike on Hawaii. They fell into the trap of preconceived notions. They believed Japan lacked the technical skill and the nerve for such a massive gamble. Even on the day of the attack, the warnings were ignored. A radar operator spotted the incoming planes, but was told they were just a flight of B-17s from the mainland. A 14-part telegram from Tokyo was decoded in Washington, but the final warning arrived in Hawaii 4 hours after the first bombs fell. The sleeping giant was woken by a punch it should have seen coming, proving that in intelligence, having the pieces of the puzzle is useless if you don't know how to put them together. Pearl Harbor remains the ultimate warning about bureaucratic silos. It showed that even the most advanced technology can't save you if your intelligence agencies are too busy fighting each other to watch the horizon. But as the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the Allies were about to turn the tables, using the very same codes to lure the Japanese into a trap of their own. If Pearl Harbor was a failure of imagination, Midway was its redemption. By early 1942, the U.S. Navy was still reeling, but they held a secret weapon, a group of codebreakers in Hawaii known as Station HYPO. Working in a windowless basement, they had partially cracked the Japanese naval code, JN-25. They knew Admiral Yamamoto was planning a massive, decisive battle, but there was one critical missing piece, the target, identified only as the codename AF. Washington was convinced AF meant the West Coast. But the codebreakers in Hawaii suspected it was Midway Atoll. To prove it, they staged one of the most brilliant intelligence traps in history. They instructed the Midway base to send an unencrypted radio message claiming their freshwater condenser had broken down. A few days later, they intercepted a Japanese report, AF is short on water. The trap was sprung. The Americans knew exactly where the Japanese fleet was going and when they would arrive. Admiral Nimitz didn't just guess, he bet his entire remaining fleet on this single piece of intelligence. He moved his carriers to a Point Luck northeast of Midway, waiting in total silence. When the Japanese carriers launched their planes to attack the island, they had no idea 3 American carriers were already behind them. In just 6 minutes, American dive bombers turned 3 of Japan's elite carriers into burning wrecks. The 4th would follow later that day. Midway proved that information, not armor, wins naval wars. The Japanese were superior in every measurable category, more ships, better planes, more experienced pilots, but they were tactically blind. They sailed into a battle that had already been lost in a basement in Hawaii. This victory shifted the momentum of the entire Pacific War, showing that a single decoded word can be more powerful than a fleet of battleships. The brilliance of the Midway trap lay not just in the trick itself, but in the defiance of hierarchy. In Washington, top-level analysts ridiculed the idea that Japan would care about a tiny atoll like Midway. They were looking at the big picture, convinced the target was San Francisco or Seattle. But Commander Joseph Rockefort and his team at Station HYPO lived in the noise. They noticed tiny linguistic patterns and radio traffic densities that others missed. They didn't just decode messages, they read the personality of the Japanese Navy. When the water shortage BLUFF confirmed Midway was the target, it gave the Americans the ultimate advantage in war, the initiative. In every previous engagement, the U.S. had been reactive, scrambling to answer Japanese moves. Now, for the first time, they were the hunters. Admiral Nimitz took a colossal gamble by stripping the defenses of the American coast to concentrate his forces at Point Luck. If the codebreakers had been wrong, the U.S. would have left the California coast wide open to invasion. The Japanese, meanwhile, fell victim to victory disease, a form of collective arrogance. They were so convinced of their own superiority and the blindness of the Americans that they didn't even bother to scout the area thoroughly. They assumed the U.S. carriers were still in port, licking their wounds from previous battles. This lack of curiosity was their undoing. At Midway, the fog of war was one-sided, the Americans could see perfectly through the mist, while the Japanese were sailing toward a horizon that didn't exist. The outcome of those 6 minutes of fire and steel was the direct result of hours of silence and deduction. It proved that in the age of electronic warfare, the most important terrain isn't a hill or an ocean, it's the electromagnetic spectrum. Midway wasn't just a naval victory, it was the birth of modern signals intelligence as a primary instrument of national survival. In early 1943, the Allies faced a massive problem. Everyone knew they were going to invade southern Europe, and everyone knew Sicily was the only logical target. Even Winston Churchill remarked, "Only a fool would not know it is Sicily." The Germans were already moving divisions to fortify the island. To save the invasion, British intelligence, MI5 and MI6, launched Operation Mincemeat, one of the most surreal and successful deceptions in the history of warfare. The plan was as macabre as it was brilliant. They took the body of a homeless man who had died in London, dressed him in the uniform of a Royal Marines officer, and created a completely fake life for him, Major William Martin. They filled his pockets with love letters from a fictional fiancée, theater tickets, and, most importantly, a briefcase chained to his wrist containing top-secret personal letters between British generals. These letters suggested that the real targets were Greece and Sardinia, and that the buildup in Sicily was merely a feint. The body was released from a submarine off the coast of Spain, where they knew pro-Nazi officials would find it and pass the documents to the Abwehr, German intelligence. The Germans took the bait completely. They analyzed every scrap of paper, from the fiancée's photograph to the overdue bank notice in Martin's pocket. They were so convinced by the human details that they ignored the logistical impossibility of the plan. Even Hitler was fooled, personally ordering the relocation of panzer divisions from France and the Eastern Front to Greece, leaving Sicily dangerously exposed. When the Allies finally struck Sicily in July 1943, the German High Command was still waiting for the real attack in Greece. Thousands of Allied lives were saved because of a corpse with a briefcase. Operation Mincemeat proved that intelligence isn't just about stealing secrets, it's about planting the right lie in a mind that is already looking for a reason to be afraid. The man who never won a campaign without firing a single shot. While the Allies used corpses and radio bluffs to deceive the enemy, their greatest advantage remained invisible. Deep in the English countryside, at a Victorian estate known as Bletchley Park, a group of mathematicians, chess champions, and linguists were fighting a war of pure logic. Their target was Enigma, the German electromechanical rotor machine that provided unbreakable encryption for the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and, most crucially, the U-boat fleet. The Germans were so confident in Enigma's 158 quintillion possible settings that they entrusted it with their most sensitive secrets. They didn't realize that a team led by Alan Turing had built the bomb, an early electromechanical computer designed to sort through these trillions of combinations. By 1941, the British were reading Hitler's most private directives, often before his own generals in the field. This source of intelligence was so sensitive it was given the highest classification. Ultra. The impact of Ultra on the Battle of the Atlantic was decisive. Before the code was cracked, German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be built, threatening to starve Britain into submission. Once Turing's team broke the naval codes, the Allies began rerouting convoys around the wolf packs and sending destroyers directly to the U-boats' secret refueling points. The hunters became the hunted. It is estimated that the work at Bletchley Park shortened the war in Europe by at least 2 years and saved millions of lives. But the greatest challenge of Ultra wasn't just cracking the code, it was protecting the secret. The Allies had to be careful not to act on every piece of intelligence they gathered. If they reacted too perfectly, the Germans would realize Enigma was compromised and change the system. This led to agonizing ethical dilemmas. Churchill sometimes had to allow certain attacks to happen to prevent the enemy from smelling a rat. At Bletchley Park, the Allies learned that in the world of high-level intelligence, knowing the truth is only half the battle, the other half is knowing how to hide the fact that you know it. By September 1944, the Allies were drunk on success. This victory fever led to the war's final intelligence disaster, Operation Market Garden. It was a tragedy of confirmation bias. Leaders saw only the data they liked and ignored the rest. The evidence was undeniable. Dutch resistance and aerial photos showed elite SS Panzer divisions refitting exactly where paratroopers were scheduled to land. British officers held clear photos of German tanks in the woods near Arnhem. Yet, High Command dismissed these warnings as unreliable. They were so committed to their plan that they became blind to the steel staring them in the face. The result was a slaughter. Paratroopers dropped directly onto heavy armor, leading to the "bridge too far" catastrophe. Market Garden proved that even the best intelligence is worthless if leaders refuse to believe it. Hubris blinded the victors at the moment of their triumph. The lesson is clear. Information is always filtered through ego and fear. The side that won was the one most willing to accept uncomfortable truths over pleasant lies. From Bletchley Park to Arnhem, the war taught us that the most powerful weapon isn't a machine, it's the intellectual honesty to see reality. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel for more history without myths.